All right, guys. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Results Loading Podcast hosted by Prosperous AI. I'm your host, Michael Atkin, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Ivan Lai, who is currently serving as the Senior Director of Supply Chain at Outset Medical and is a seasoned supply chain executive with over 2 years of experience across industries such as automotive, aerospace, and medical devices. We'll be diving into Ivan's remarkable journey, exploring the strategies behind building resilient supply chains, optimizing global operations, and leveraging data-driven decisions for competitive advantage. I will let him tell you more about all of this himself. But with all that being said, Ivan, welcome. Thanks so much for agreeing to be on the podcast today.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely, man. Looking forward to this one. And Ivan, I want to dive right into it. Take us through your career journey a little bit. What initially sparked your interest in supply chain and operations management? Kind of walk us through where we started and really how we got to where we are now, senior director level, and how all this came to be.
Yeah, happy to. So I'll start from picking a major for college. I was good at math and science. Really couldn't figure out what I wanted to do as a major. So just because I like tinkering with things, I ended up picking mechanical engineering. And actually that was my major in college. And as I was going through, I had a friend that was in, so I went to Cornell for college, had a friend that was majoring in operations research and industrial engineering. And I started to realize mechanical was fun. It was very technical and detailed. Whereas I really enjoyed the operations research and supply chain aspect of being able to see broader on how the business operates. So by the time I realized I really wanted to switch, I was close to finishing my bachelor's. So I ended up finishing my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, applied for a master's in operations research and industrial engineering, stayed at Cornell, got that done. And from there, accepted a job offer in supply chain management consulting with PricewaterhouseCoopers out on the West Coast. And that got me into, first exposure in supply chain, doing both systems implementation projects as well as process improvements. So I got to play, work with a few different customers, clients in different industries, high-tech, automotive, industrial goods. So great exposure into the high level of supply chain. And then from there, one of the prior consultants in the same group was heading up the supply chain team at Johnson & Johnson company called Bowson's Webster. Talked to him. He brought me into Johnson & Johnson, and that was my career into medical device. So I went in as a planning analyst, ended up managing the planning team, the materials team, purchasing. So that was a great experience in the company side, away from consulting. And from there, just moved on to Abbott was my next company. Had a phenomenal experience transforming the supply chain there. A little tangent. When I interviewed with Abbott, it was actually a company called Guidance. Johnson & Johnson announced they were acquiring Guidance. So I interviewed and say, hey, love to join you guys and show you the J&J way. The acquisition didn't go through. Abbott and Boston Scientific won the bid. They liked what I had to offer, brought me in anyway. And I went in to start helping them plan for the biggest product launch they had, which was a drug-eluting stents. Got that through product launch. Opportunity came up to run manufacturing. And that was the biggest team I've ever managed. 570 people or so in production and manufacturing engineering. Had a blast leading that. Scaled up production to meet the launch demand. From there, Abbott was getting serious in transforming the supply chain to a more mature state. So I started the supply chain management team at that Southern California site. We had about 5,000 people at the time. So I actually started the supply chain group, took over purchasing, started planning and materials handling, worked with a consulting team called Oliver White, got it to what we considered, Class A accreditation, Class A accreditation in about 2 years. From there, I moved on to lead the strategic sourcing and contract management team. And that was a lot of fun, introducing Abbott to the different suppliers, contract manufacturers, contract partners, outsourcing projects, etc. So that was about 7 years in Abbott. And from there, I stayed with the medical device industry and worked with St. Jude Medical, Stryker, Dexcom, and most recently, I'm with Outset at this time, working in different areas within supply chain, manufacturing, engineering arena, kind of trying out different spaces.
So as a senior director at Outset, for example, and you've worked at Stryker, I think, you mentioned Abbott, Johnson & Johnson. Did you mention Ethicon in there as well? Isn't Ethicon a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson?
They are. Ethicon is part of Johnson & Johnson. I did not work at Ethicon. I worked at Johnson Webster.
Got it. So the mechanical engineering element, can you connect the dots for us? I've had a few supply chain execs and leaders here on the show before who also have a mechanical engineering background. What is the deal with mechanical engineers getting into the supply chain element? Is it because of the product that you're managing, and that there's obviously in the medical device world, there's a lot of, engineering underlying aspects going on there? What is the connection between mechanical engineering and then operation, supply chain, procurement? Can you walk us through why there seems to be becoming an underlying theme here with that?
Yes, absolutely. So I can speak to it from my personal perspective. One is, they're both heavy on analytics, right? So you kind of rely on data on both sides, and having that fundamental engineering background allows you to look at things not from the emotion, but from data-driven decisions. So I think that's helpful. The other one, more tangible relation would be, yes, when we're talking about supply chain. For example, if I'm going out and trying to find suppliers for certain parts, I first need to understand how the part works. What are the critical specs? How does it interrelate with other parts of the product we build, right? And understand the mechanical aspect of that really helps us to determine what's important and what's not, and communicate that with suppliers. And also, as we assess suppliers, it's not just about are they good business partners to deal with, but also looking at their technical capabilities, capacity, ability to control quality, and having a mechanical background really helps you in diving into that aspect as well, right? Because a lot of times, supplier quality, component engineering, and supply chain, they all go hand in hand.
Right. So mainly the idea here is that due to the complexity of the supply chain that you're moving, the product that moves within that supply chain, the mechanical engineering side and the ability to think like an engineer from that technical approach is helpful when it comes to something like medical devices, obviously. It's different than if you're managing supply chain for like wood and concrete, for example, I'd imagine.
Absolutely.
Many more components going on when you're dealing with pacemakers and disease state devices and whatnot. You need to kind of have that technical brain to help make those decisions, especially in terms of complexities of the device, as well as components coming from, I would imagine, all over the world you're managing.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. And Ivan, with that being said, I mean, you've managed supply chains that span across continents. What are some of the biggest challenges when expanding a global supply chain network and how have you been overcoming them? Especially like we just discussed, a lot of complexities, a lot of components coming from all over the place. How are you bringing that home and making sure that you're maximizing your efficiencies there?
Yeah, so on the globalization front, I mean, there's challenging on the upstream sourcing side. There's also challenges on the downstream distribution side, right? So I can shift gears to the distribution aspect now. So if you think medical device, the main product, so let's say I got an AirPod here, right? Let's say this is a hearing aid, and I'm primarily a US-centric company. Now I want to go into France, Germany, Japan. it's still the same product, and users there can use it the same way. So people would think, okay, just package it up, ship it the same way, right? Now, in reality, it's not that simple, because even though it's the same product, let's say regulatory body in Europe is, EU MDR guidance. They require certain differences in labels. You need to add different languages in the instruction for use. So now all of a sudden you're changing the labels, the IFUs, and maybe some things about the product to be able to ship there. So from that, people would say, okay, then let's just add that on and then we can ship the same product. But for the same product, same box, now you make that change. Now FDA in the US says, wait. I didn't approve those changes, right? Now you need to let me review it. And you're ready to go to start selling in France, and now you're putting on hold, waiting for FDA to clear. And you go to a different country, same thing, you got to go through that again. Anytime one country wants to make a change, everybody else needs to approve. And by the time you wait for that, it's time for another change. So I would say like that is the type of challenges that not a lot of people think about, right? People think about marketing and distribution channel and customer use. So this is what I call configuration management. I've seen that as a challenge in several medical device companies. And the most obvious way to deal with that is companies usually start by saying, okay, then I'll just create a different part number, right? You can have the same product, same box, different labels, different IFUs, and we'll sell that to France. And Japan comes along, okay, with another part number for Japan. But part number proliferation is very dangerous in supply chain, right? The more finely you divide up your demand, your product portfolio, the more unpredictable your demand is, the more inventory you need to carry, the more excess and obsolescence. So, the part number proliferation is a huge enemy for supply chain. But when you go to the second company, that's the easiest way to go. When you go to a third one, you can still manage it. By the time companies realize this is not sustainable, you're now at fifth, sixth country, and trying to come back and fundamentally change how you manage your supply chain is really difficult if you make that change down the road. So what I would try to do is really catch companies early on and say, yeah, I know this is harder when you go to the second and third country, but over time it's going to save you a lot more hassle, right? And to make that transformation early on to say, hey, let's go for delayed differentiation. If this part is the same for everybody, let's just build this and store it. For the last phase, whether it's boxes, labels, IFUs, that final stage differentiation, apply that at the end for different countries. And this way you have the best of both worlds. You can meet the country's needs without relying on everybody else agreeing, and you can keep your supply chain relatively simple.
Because that way, in time, you've gotten a product to a point when all the countries are on the same page. Because I was going to circle back to your point about part number proliferation. And it does seem easier to just have the same product, but a SKU for Japan, a SKU for the EU, a SKU for America, etc. And all those part numbers are associated with the different regulations and everything that each country brings to the table. But obviously that creates more management for the supply chain directors and the executives, as opposed to, I guess what you're saying, to be clear, is in time, once you're able to get through all those hoops and leaps and bounds and whatnot, then you get to that third, fourth, fifth, and sixth stage. Everyone starts to agree, and all these issues start to go away, especially when you're trying to roll out a new product, correct?
Absolutely. So in the short term, when they're different, you still keep the core product the same, and you just have differentiation in the final stages. Over time, get everybody on the same page, so you narrow it back down to one or two SKUs, exactly.
So how long does it take to get to the point when you can get everyone on the same 1 to 2 SKUs, for example? What does that process look like? Because initially when you were mentioning about the part number proliferation, I was like, oh, done. That sounds easy. That's what anyone would do, and just forget the regulations for individual countries. Japan gets their own SKU, the US gets their own SKU, Germany gets their own SKU, done deal. But it sounds like it creates more hassle. That's a short-term Band-Aid as opposed to a long-term solution, essentially.
Yes. And different countries have roughly different If you need to file for changes, right? There's class 1, 2, and 3 medical device. Class 1 and 2 are more 510K type filing if it's a major change. Class 3, you got to go PMA. It's even longer approvals. So it could be as short as 6 months. It could be as long as 2 years for a class 3 type device in a country like Japan.
And then working in an industry such as medical devices, I mean, this is a fragile and delicate situation, and a lot of rules and regulations are applicable to the industry that you work in. Is that landing on your desk as well? I know we're dealing with the parts and the regulations that you deal with that we just discussed, but in terms of ensuring that these are FDA approved, does that land on your desk as well? And is that your problem, or is that someone else's issue to deal with to make sure that the products that you're managing, I guess, in terms of the supply chain are safe and essentially safe to use and implement into people for the betterment of their health?
Good question. So the core responsibility is not in supply chain, right? To analyze the changes that are allowed in the regulations and to make the filing. You usually have R&D and regulatory and quality that are more involved in that area. What I would say, though, is in terms of best practice supply chain, and I've seen it both ways, done well and not so well, is the traditional way is you have R&D and regulatory kind of figure out how to develop a product, how to file it. And when it's about to get approved, you involve operations, supply chain, and say, help launch this, right? But if you have this kind of pass the baton approach, it's really dangerous because you end up making filing decisions that could impact supply chain down the road and the business down the road without realizing it. So I'll give you a good example. We had a company I was at leading supply chain. We were managing a pretty drastic a product change, and we finally got approval in the country, and we still had 3 months worth of product left. And we said, okay, let's go ahead and deplete this, and then we'll switch over. But no, we couldn't. The day after we get approval, we have to stop selling the old product, and that's a lot of excess inventory. And I started digging into why. Like, why is this the only way we can get approval? And the simple answer was because that's what we asked for when we filed, right? If we knew, we could have asked for a 6-month transition period and we wouldn't have this issue. And that's, it was a really hard lesson learned. And then since then, I made sure I have great relationship and collaboration with the regulatory functions upstream so that we can kind of strategize all this stuff before we make any submissions, right, to the regulatory bodies.
Right. Yeah. And of course, like, not your responsibility in terms of like the R&D and ensuring that the product actually works and the pacemakers are actually going to help people with cardio issues, for example. But in terms of bringing the parts in and that stuff landing on your desk and having an understanding of what the regulations committees are really asking for, that becomes your headache if I guess in time those lessons are learned that you just described, but eventually those lessons are learned and you start to understand better, especially in a complex and fragile industry such as med device, how to go about those transitions, especially when you're rolling out a new version of a product, for example.
Exactly. And that kind of circles back to your earlier question as well in terms of the challenges of managing an international company, right? Different countries have different regulatory bodies that have their unique requirements. So it also helps, even though I'm not a regulatory expert, to understand those nuances in different countries, right, on the regulatory side and in other parts of the culture, so that we can tailor our supply chain approach to individual countries appropriately. So regulatory is one. The other example I would throw out back to the international side would be, for China, for example, understanding their demand fluctuations. Right before Chinese New Year, demand goes up and then it disappears because everybody goes on break, right? And then you have weird nuances like in Brazil, for most countries, you set up an importation port and that's what you use. In Brazil, we actually hired a service because the lead time for getting into the ports could be really long at times. So we hire a service that monitor what's the lead time for these ports. Okay, now let's direct the traffic in these ports next week and then switch back the following week. So that will be another challenge for international, is to understand the unique challenges in each country, right? Whether it's on the forecasting side, on the logistics side, on the planning side, so that we can adjust our approach accordingly.
Absolutely. And it brings up like an interesting thought in my head about unprecedented situations such as you can recall, the Suez Canal blockage or COVID-19, for example. I mean, I remember Suez Canal was costing the global supply chain market, I think it was like $5 billion a day or something like that. And it's either wait it out and hope that it opens up and they figure out how to move the ship out of the way, or you have to reroute all of the freighters around the Horn of Africa, which takes an additional 3 weeks, which, as you know, costs hundreds of thousands of dollars per day to operate. As a supply chain expert, what are your thoughts on those kinds of situations? Obviously, they're, each one is unique and unprecedented in its own way, but how are you approaching those types of situations? Supply chain has been in the news more so lately. I'm not sure why, but with situations like that, I mean, what is your take on those kinds of challenges, and how do you approach dealing with some of those things that are, very unique, to put it lightly?
Yeah. So the supply chain risk management has been a huge topic ever since COVID hit everybody by surprise, right? So I've actually I've done a lot of work in this area, and I gave a keynote on this a while back. Like, our approach is there are countless supply chain risks, from severe to light, frequent to rare. So it's best to kind of take that 2x2 approach and look at the risks that are really severe, or the risks that could happen more frequently. Those severe ones, it pays to do some mitigation planning up front and basically pay for an insurance policy, if you will, right? So the business continuity plan for that, plan for your plan B, so that if those predictable risks happens, you have ways to mitigate that. And it could be dual sourcing for different suppliers at different continents, so that if one gets chopped off, you can go to the other one.
And Ivan, sorry to interrupt. When you say predictable, you mean things like weather and inventory, right? I mean, you can't plan for like a natural catastrophe or a Suez Canal or a COVID-19, obviously.
Exactly.
Right? So those are predictable risk mitigation situations, right?
Right. So for the ones that are really not predictable, or you don't expect it to happen, every year, there are some risks that I would say you try to plan on how do we react quickly if something happens. And supply chain people are usually really good at thinking on their feet and reacting. That's our daily lives, right? So there are risks that you put together a business continuity plan for, and there are things that you just, when things happen, you choose not to plan for those things, because you can't pay for insurance for everything. But when it happens, we just get people together across the extended supply chain and look for ways to get around it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, because it's like, you wish as a supply chain leader that you can almost predict the future, obviously. But I keep chuckling about like the Suez Canal situation, and it's like, what do we do? They could move this any second and we could just sit here. Or I think, the other route was you have to go around the Horn of Africa or all the way around South America to get things through, and it was going to take weeks. And it's like, with the most advanced AI and predictive analytics and anything like that, you can't plan for this stuff. So I guess to your point, gather everybody up and get them in a room and just say, guys, what is the most efficient way to handle this situation? It's costing us millions of dollars per second, basically. How do we get through this? Right. And sometimes it's just a bad day at the office, I'd imagine.
Exactly. We have a lot of those in supply chain everywhere.
Absolutely. No. And I totally get that. And with that being said, I think you've emphasized before and a little bit today on the importance of data-driven supply chain decisions.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you're leveraging the data to make data-driven decisions that mitigate risk as much as possible? Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be in your current job, but just in general, maybe share an example of when you've leveraged data to make a decision that had a significant improvement or breakthrough based on what the initial plan was, for example.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a passion of mine. So data-driven decisions, supply chain digitization, those are buzzwords thrown around. It could mean different things for different people. The way I see it, the biggest challenge and most critical aspect of this area is to provide visibility through your extended supply chain, right? From your tier 1, tier 2 suppliers all the way through your end customers. Most supply chain professionals are smart people. If you provide the right data, they can make the right decisions for the most part. The toughest part is, how do you provide the right data, not just within the 4 walls of your facility, but throughout the extended supply chain so you can make the right decisions. And ideally, and this is what we're pretty close to building out at Outset, ideally what you want to do is you have your functional specific systems, right? Your Salesforce, your ERP systems, your manufacturing, MES systems. You have different planning systems, different ones, and you want to aggregate that and pull all the data into a central data warehouse or data lake. And that gives you a one-stop shop for all the data in your extended supply chain. Then you build a query system. So we use AWS. And there's Athena, where you can build really powerful queries to manipulate data any way you want, to convert data into usable information. Then you have the top tier, which is visualization tool, like AWS QuickSight or Tableau. That then converts that into easily digestible information that you can share with the stakeholders, the decision makers, to make the right decision. So to me, the most fundamental part of data-driven decision is to build up this infrastructure so that you have easy access of data and visibility throughout your supply chain. Once that's done, the rest is relatively easy. And yes, of course, you can build sophisticated planning tools. You can even build AI tools on top of that, which I'm also really passionate about. But it all starts with getting the right data. And as fundamental as that is, it's surprising how many companies still struggle with it. And it's not just because they don't do it, right? It's also because business environments change. Every time you acquire a company, every time you divest a part, things change, and then you're back to having to consolidate everything.
Absolutely. And I really, really agree. I mean, with Prosperous, that's really a space that we play in terms of getting your data organized, starting with, as you said at the bottom, like data lakes, data warehouses, getting that data clean. So when you're at a point when you're using tools like Athena and Tableau, even if you're using a semantic layer, an AI overlay, or anything like that, you're able to query all of your data and your business intelligence using natural language and getting those, deep insights, predictive analytics. A huge, huge revolutionary thing, and I don't have to explain this to you, in supply chain, and with the onslaught of AI and the capabilities there, and ensuring, as you said, first of all, there's kind of those 3 tiers of the infrastructure that you need before, you start really making those data-driven insights, making sure the data is clean, because I think, to your point, there's a lot of companies who aren't harnessing the technology and the data like they could today. Data these days is like gold. There's so many insights that are being untapped. And I think in the past, we've been using data scientists and, going through tens of thousands of lines of Excel sheets. A lot of, ERP systems have been living in Excel. It's hard to interpret data when you have tens of thousands of line items worth of data. And it's like, okay, maybe it'll take a data scientist 6 weeks to interpret this. And by the time you have reports and insights, the data is 6 weeks old and it doesn't matter anymore, right? Exactly. And so the ability now that you can literally, using natural language, query your data and get those instant insights, I think is super revolutionary, especially for the supply chain industry, because you're able to get them in seconds as opposed to maybe weeks or longer, and be able to make some of those data-driven decisions that could have potentially save your company hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on one specific project or one specific deal or what have you, right?
Absolutely. Totally agree.
Yeah. So no, I think supply chain is one of my favorite industries to discuss in terms of the data, what the data can do for you and what the technology can do for you, just because there's such a high ceiling in terms of how it can help optimize all of the processes, the operations, and everything in between. And it's relatively new. It's not like the construction industry when they're about a decade behind technologically. Supply chain, it's not that far behind, as you know, but there are just so many capabilities now available to you to make those data-driven insights and get those predictive analytics and just make things go much smoother in an industry that sometimes needs help with that stuff, right?
Absolutely. So like, there's a lot more we can do, and I'm really excited to see what the future holds. Now, in terms of the examples of how we do it today, which certainly could use some improvements, but once we have the data, right, on the sourcing side, we can do spend analytics, looking at our spend by commodity group, by suppliers, by geographic areas, by the freight costs that we spend on bringing materials in. And, having that data, you can really hone in on, okay, where's our opportunity? Where's the biggest bang for the buck? Now let's dive into those areas that it's worth our while, right? And that's on the sourcing side. On the distribution side, one great example we had recently was we have 3 distribution centers in the US, East, West, and Central. And we, even though we're placing orders and running MRP based on our forecasted demand for each DC and placing POs for those deliveries, forecast is not always perfect, and we end up having too much inventory in some locations and not enough in others. And we waste money moving inventory back and forth just to balance it out, right? Whereas now we enhanced our systems, give the planners and buyers more visibility real time on what's happening day to day, week to week. Now they're monitoring it and say, okay, this next shipment next week, I know I ordered it for the West. I really need more on the East Coast, and redirect that shipment over to the East Coast. And it really saved a lot of unnecessary waste in moving things around. We just direct it to the right spot, on a timely basis. So those are all great examples, right, of how we use data today. Now, in the future, I'm sure we can get to the point where we don't need somebody looking at that a couple times a week. We can just rely on the AI tool, right, to help us make those decisions that are more mundane.
Right. And having the live dashboards, you wake up and go to work in the morning, you refresh it, and it gives you all the insights you need. Oh, the East warehouse may need like X more units for the next month, so we can just move them over, and then it's done. You've taken care of that, right? As opposed to, like you said, sending product from warehouse to warehouse and it costing dollars, and it kind of just being a little bit out of control. Now you can make those data-driven insights. We've said it a bunch of times. I'll say it again, and call it a day after that, right? And that you're making the right decision because the data is literally speaking to you and telling you what you need to do with shipping, product, supply. All of it is taken care of, right? And so, Ivan, it sounds like you have all of that optimized on the tech and the data side. What about your teams? So how are we ensuring that your teams are using the data effectively to maintain agility and responsiveness in the supply chain planning, and that you're getting the buy-in to maximize that efficiency that you're obviously a living, breathing example of at the moment, especially in the supply chain and operations industry?
Yeah, great question. I'll kind of talk through our practice right now to get the teams on board, and also the challenge I see to migrate the teams towards the future, AI environment, which could be a little tougher. So today, I've gotten involved in many systems implementation process implementation projects, and I've seen way too many times where people spend so much time putting together processes, systems, roll it out, and it doesn't really get widely adopted. And a year later, you scrap it, right? All that goes to waste. So, from lessons I've learned before, what I try to do when we lead these change projects now is, one, make sure we identify the key decision makers, key opinion leaders early on in the development process, right? Get their voice in there to shape what the solution looks like. And they're your biggest allies, the best salespeople to kind of sell those changes through the rest of the organization. Right, people are so much more willing to adopt a change when they have a voice in shaping that. So that's definitely number one. And number two is, as we roll it out, really standardize the process across the board, document the new process and the new tools, and provide plenty of training, both in classroom environment as well as one-on-one mentoring. This classroom is almost always not enough. And just really have that hands-on training and tons of support early on in the transition until everybody gets comfortable, and then we can slowly back off and make sure the project, the changes are sustainable.
Right, because I think, and I would imagine you'd agree, and a lot of business leaders and executives and directors and VPs that I've had on the Results Loading podcast have all mentioned, when applying and implementing new processes, hands-on is the best way. I mean, to your point, the classroom almost isn't enough. You can sit in the classroom all day, but until you're able to get your hands on, the new various processes and implementations, that's really when, like you said, you can start to back off. People are using it every day. Everyone gets on the same page. We're now taking the efficiencies that you're setting and the tone that you're setting, and it's spreading down the ladder, if you will, and trickling down into everybody. There's eventual buy-in, especially with big teams and complex products like what you're dealing with. You kind of need that buy-in, right? You need everyone to kind of be on the same page. Straggler kind of being left behind can really hurt the process, right?
Absolutely. And that kind of leads me to, I'm a huge fan of machine learning, right? The tools that are coming that can make a huge change. My biggest concern around that is it does take additional knowledge to learn machine learning algorithms, and not a lot of supply chain professionals have that fundamental background to learn this. And that's dangerous, because if I'm using machine learning tools and I don't really understand the algorithms behind how it works, I wave a magic wand and it spits out the answer to me. How am I then accountable for the outcome, right? If that answer doesn't pan out, who's accountable? The developer for the tool, or is it me? What's my area? I should be accountable. So I think that will be one of the biggest challenges as we go through this machine learning or AI revolution, is how do you upscale your workforce to really understand what's working behind the scenes, right? So that they can take advantage of these new tools, but also know how to tweak it, how to fine tune it, so that they're ultimately still accountable for the outcome and not just using a black box without knowing what's happening inside.
Right. No, I like that a lot. And there's some accountability with the outcome, as opposed to, oh, I have AI, like my job is super easy and that's it. Right. That's what we want to avoid. That's been a hot topic around AI, obviously, across the board, not just in supply chain. It's like affecting education, affecting various types of jobs that can be replaced by AI. Obviously, it hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it will happen for a long time. But I think you bring a good point in terms of what I think is probably part of your leadership philosophy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if we're going to use these tools and they're going to really optimize and increase the efficiencies of our processes, let's understand how they work, and let's make sure that there's a sense of accountability in terms of maintaining that high quality result, as opposed to doing an eighth of the work because we have tools to come and help optimize our processes, and then kind of call it a day, and then not making sure that things are going as smoothly as they did before we implemented these kinds of new tools, right?
Absolutely. So yeah, two things I would really challenge the workforce to do. One is still be accountable, right? Regardless of how fancy the tool is you use, you are ultimately accountable. So you need to understand it. But two is really also just from picking the right tool to begin with. I mean, there are so many different options now, even though people say AI is one thing. If you look at machine learning, right, there's so many algorithms. You have linear regression, logistics regression, decision tree, neural network, and they're all different. They're all created to be suitable for slightly different purposes, right? So even if you have, all the different service providers and suppliers coming to you with all these different options, what's available for you to use, making that decision on which one do you really want to pursue. First of all, you need to have some fundamental education to do that, right? So, for me, it was easy because I find that fascinating. So I really, in the past year or so, I took it on as a personal goal and a hobby to really dig into that. go through Stanford certification programs and really learn all this. But I think it's one thing that is absolutely necessary as companies go down that journey, is to put their workforce through some necessary background training to make the right decisions up front and to still be able to fine tune and be accountable for the outcome.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about this a few times, but I think it's especially necessary and specifically important when you're working in an industry like medical devices. You know, like we can use AI in supply chain across the board. You and I agree on that. But going back to like and not to speak poorly about any specific industry within supply, but it's my point about like the wood and concrete supply chain. It's not as important. Like, people need to be probably a little bit more. There's more accountability in the industry you work in, and it speaks for itself, right? We can't have people falling behind or not completely aware of what's going on, especially when you're dealing with all of these various elements of everything we've discussed today, from sourcing parts from all over the world to making sure that we have regulatory compliances checked off and that we're not stepping on anyone's toes in any countries or anything like that. That attitude needs to trickle down to the team as well. And like you said, as you're implementing tools and improving those processes, people need to be aware of what's going on. It's really important because there's a lot at stake and there's a reputation on the line. And we're not just selling wood. I mean, we're selling life-saving devices, which come with a lot of extra baggage, and people need to be aware of how we're handling some of these operational elements to you know, specifically what you guys are working on the day-to-day. Right?
Exactly, Michael. Really well said. And to me, like, knowing when to use AI, it's equally important to know when not to use it, right? There are great work cases on when you should use it. For example, our manufacturing team uses AI optical system with AI logic to help identify defects. And that makes the operator's life so much easier, right? And that's a perfect example of when AI is great. The flip side of where I get a little cautious is, you know, there are a lot of options now using AI to forecast. And that scares me because AI is great if you have a large amount of relevant data. For forecasting, that's not always true. If you have a new product, if you're going into a new country, you don't have that large amount of data to drive good decisions. And it's really up to the users to know when to use it to its fullest and when to avoid it.
It's a great example. It's a great example because AI works really well when you have the clean data in the data warehouses that's ready to go and give you those insights. And if we're making assumptions, you say, hey, help me with this forecasting for Vietnam, and we've never sold this product or in this country, how are we supposed to know if anything that AI tells us is going to be efficient and productive for what we're doing? And it's like, okay, like, let's whip out 100,000 units and you only need like 10,000. You're going to be in big trouble.
Exactly.
And then who are you going to blame? AI? No. I mean, to your point,
right.
It's like there has to be some accountability there. There has to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Ivan, looking back at your career, it's been an illustrious one, obviously, thus far, and you know, obviously a lot to accomplish on the horizon for you as well. You've already accomplished so much. What is one of your favorite lessons that you've learned that's been particularly valuable as your journey as a leader, then as well as a supply chain leader, a business leader as well as a supply chain leader, I should say?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thinking back, I would say, you know, trying to come up with a methodology on how I approach different business environments, different roles. The biggest one, the biggest lessons learned would be build a strong team early on. And that means getting the right people on the bus, right? Coaching Collins, but also equally important, getting the wrong people off the bus. And that is tough. But oftentimes it's easy to procrastinate, but once you make the move, you wish you'd done it earlier. So I would say that's a big lesson. And then beyond that, it's really, you know, something I've learned along the way that I try to apply to different challenges, different environments, is start with forming the right team, getting the right people on the bus, and then align everybody. Alignment is key, and that means building a strategy, getting the right key stakeholders, in the room to put together a strategy and priority goals together, right? Once you have full alignment, you know people are not chasing different things, then you can start taking actions and start holding people accountable on delivering the results and the metrics. So like, I think that framework, and there's different tools for each phase, right? But taking that framework of those 4 steps, I think is really critical in making sure people are successful in whatever environment they're in. And I think once you get to the end point of, okay, we know what the problem is, we know what we want to get to, people are good at diving in and delivering those results, right? There are a lot of process improvements, Kaizens, whatnot. There's a lot of people good at that, but all that falls apart if you don't have the right people and if you don't have alignment on what we're trying to achieve for the company. So that's what I would say in terms of is the biggest learning.
Yeah, I mean, huge, right? I mean, you know, whether you've inherited a new team or you're tasked with building out your own team, I mean, you need to make sure that the team is on the same page, the talent, the skill level is there, and if not, that the enthusiasm and determination and drive are there, and then making sure everyone's aligned and that everyone's head is in the right place and that there's a common goal. It sounds so simple. I mean, you would think, but as you know, and as you've probably seen, it's not a given across the board, and requires leaders like yourself to make sure that your teams get to that point, because that's when you start seeing those ultra productive, ultra successful teams start to come into play, when you've got a bunch of varsity players on the team, as you know, for lack of a better word, and everyone's kind of striving towards the same goal. It's a simple yet beautiful thing, and takes obviously a process to get there. But once you are, I mean, the results speak for themselves.
Absolutely. Fantastic,
Ivan. And last question here, a little bit more on the looking back phase. What about advice would you offer to any emerging supply chain professionals or leaders who aspire to get to the point in your career that you've gotten and have similar aspirations to you and what you've done thus far?
For supply chain in particular, one thing I would say is early on in the career, try to go broad. It's easy for people to get caught up on when am I going to get that next promotion? When am I going to move up to the next level? But supply chain is really broad and really diverse, right? Like, it's one collective term, supply chain, but purchasing is completely different from materials or inventory management, which is completely different from sourcing, logistics, right? Systems and analytics. So one advice I would have is try to go broad and build that broad spectrum of experience and knowledge early on in the career. As you advance in your career, it's harder and harder to jump across and have that deep knowledge, which is really beneficial, right? I mean, you can do it anytime, but that would be one advice I give, is try to get that broad experience and get exposed to as much as possible throughout the different parts of the supply chain or even different parts of the business, as that will pay dividends in the long run. The other one I would say is, this is a little bit of a cliche, but network, right? Every interaction is an interview. So make a good impression, stay in touch with people and build that relationship. Help people out when you can. You never know when you can help people. You never know when you're going to need people's help. So network is absolutely key for long-term success.
Absolutely. No, and I really liked what you said about keeping it broad initially. Because I was going to say earlier, it seems like medical devices turned out to be really your bread and butter, mechanical engineering background. It's kind of like a perfect match for you and what you're good at and what has led you to be successful. So I think it's a great point. And if you're looking to get in the supply chain industry and, you're just a kid coming out of college or whatever, or graduate school, keep it broad, work in a few industries, see what you like, see what you're good at. I mean, that, really applicable, but really, really important kind of note for supply chain specifically, because as we've discussed today, not all supply chains are the same, right?
Absolutely.
So finding your bread and butter, your med device or whatever it may be, comes in time, and then, everything else will come with it.
Absolutely. Well said, Michael.
Thanks, Ivan. And Ivan, I want to thank you again so much for joining us on the Results Loading podcast. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Really appreciate the insights and everything that you've provided today within the conversation. Extremely valuable. And I think there's a lot of great takeaways. So thanks so much for joining and sharing some of those with us today.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. It's been a huge pleasure for sure. Appreciate the invite.
Absolutely. We'll do it again sometime, and good luck to you.
Sounds good. Thanks,
Thanks.
Michael.